Hello everyone, and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 9, Steppe Warriors Part 2, Wolf Packs and Warbands. Before we begin, I would just like to announce that we now have a website at therussianempirehistorypodcast.com. Content besides the episodes is rather sparse right now, but I will gradually be adding maps, links, and recommended books for further reading. There will also be transcripts in the show notes if you would like to share the show with someone who has difficulty following it in audio format. And now on with the show. 3,700 years ago, a tribe from the Srubnaya culture, successors of the Yamnaya, predecessors of the Indo-Iranic groups, settled for a couple of generations next to the Samara River, in the northern part of the Russian steppe. At midwinter, they gathered their young men, boys of perhaps 14 to 16 years old, no longer children, but not yet fully adult, for a ritual before sending them out into the wilds to become warriors. One of the tribe's dogs, not a pup, but an adult that the boys had played and hunted with, was brought to the boys, and the chief handed them an axe. To demonstrate that they were ready to be warriors, and ready to kill whatever and whoever necessary, one of them must kill the dog. The bravest, who had already begun to demonstrate his leadership among his peers, stepped forward and brought the axe down on the dog's neck, just behind the skull. As the dog roasted over the fire, the tribe's warriors regaled the youths with tales of their own warrior journey years before. Hunts in remote areas where wolves and deer were so much bigger than those around the village. Rivals from other tribes encountered and beaten. Successful raids and seductions. With the meat cooked, the boys ate, taking on the qualities of dogs and wolves: courage, stamina, ferocity. The chief took the skull of the dog, skillfully chopped it into equal pieces, and gave a piece to each boy. The head warrior hung canine teeth pendants on a leather cord around the neck of each boy. With the first thaw, they would head into the steppe to prove themselves. Stories of adolescent bands of would-be warriors, sent away from their societies to live in the wild, where they could fight and raid outside of the normal framework of tribal relations, are found across Indo-European cultures, including Germanic, Latin, Vedic, Iranian, Celtic, and Greek sources. After their time in the wild, the men would come back as adults, undergoing another ritual, such as submersion in water or burning their clothes, to symbolize their return to normality, usually accompanied by marriage and taking up their place in society. The site found at Krasnosamarsko by David W. Anthony and Dorcas R. Brown was unusual, in that the tribe settled there for a couple of generations, rather than just a season. And so they accumulated enough detritus for archaeologists to find and examine. Over 3,000 ritually killed and divided canid bones were found at the site. Some wolf, but mostly dog. They were killed at the same time of the year, in the midwinter, showed signs of being butchered for meat, although dogs were far from a normal part of diet on the steppe, and the skulls were chopped into small pieces. Of course, although we can see that the dogs were killed as part of a ritual, it is impossible to truly reconstruct with certainty what the ritual was or why it took place. What we do know is that throughout the cultures originating in the steppe, from the first Proto-Indo-European wave to the Indo-Iranic wave the Scythians belonged to, and on to the third wave, with the Slavs, Germanic, and Celtic peoples, there was a long tradition of association between dogs and wolves and warriors. Young Spartan warriors sacrificed dogs to the war god Enyalius, and the Romans had Lupercalia, the wolf festival, which Cicero described as Rome's oldest ritual, dating from a time before civilization and laws. Rome's founder Romulus was even, of course, suckled by a she-wolf, a story that has cousins in the steppe. At the eastern end of the steppe, the Asvin or Wusun were attacked by the Tokhars. Their king was killed, and the people fled to the Xiongnu. The newborn prince of the Asvin was left in the steppe grasslands. A wolf suckled him, and a crow brought him meat. A boy was abandoned in the wilderness to die, but was saved by a wolf who nursed him. The wolf would later give birth to his offspring, who became the first Turk. The Mongols claimed descent from Borticina, a blue-grey wolf from heaven. Among the Iranic peoples, in Zoroastrian legend, the child Zoroaster was carried away by the Devs and thrown into a den of wolves. But rather than eat him, the wolves adopted the child. Dogs had a particular significance in Zoroastrianism, serving as the protectors of Asher, goodness, constructiveness, and innocence, against Druj, destructiveness and evil. At funerals, dogs would be brought in to view the body, to ensure that the deceased had protection in the afterlife. But getting back to our boys in the steppe, linguists have reconstructed the term corius from descendant cognates including carius, army in Baltic, corius, troop in Celtic, harius, raiding party in Germanic, and corionis, war leader in ancient Greek, to refer to these roving bands of adolescent warriors. Sent away from their tribe with only their weapons, they lived outside of normal society for several years. They spent their time hunting, raiding, and sexually assaulting women, and provided these activities were not directed at their own home people, they were tolerated and considered a normal rite of passage that did not give rise to the same consequences that they would for adult men. Each band would select a leader, and the rest of the boys would swear an oath to kill and die for him. The leader was regarded as their master, and the rest of the boys were his bodyguard and retainers. They would wear wolf and dog skins to symbolize their status, and give themselves names containing the word wolf or dog, assuming the idealized attributes of the animals: speed, strength, ferocity, intelligence, and pack unity. This identification with wild animals justified their place outside of society and meant that they could kill, steal, and rape without remorse. The widespread European folk tradition of the werewolf quite possibly has its origin in these young warriors. Another feature of the corius was the warrior fury or madness, an ecstatic state in which the warrior would gain unstoppable strength and lose all fear. They would work themselves up before battle with dancing and drugs, before flinging themselves naked into the fray. This practice survived into the Germanic and Celtic berserkers, who also dressed in animal skins and fought in the nude. At times, the roving bands would return to their homes and immortalize their exploits in heroic poetry. Myths of heroic cattle raids are common among Indo-European peoples. In one of the earliest myths, the gods have given people cattle as a divine gift, but it is stolen by a three-headed serpent or dragon. Trito, the first warrior, sets out to recover the cattle, but is at first defeated by the serpent. With the aid of Soma, an intoxicating beverage that gives him heroic powers, and the assistance of the storm god, he ultimately overcomes the monster and recovers the cattle. This myth is seen as establishing the model of the warrior's function, which along with the war leader or king and priests formed the three pillars of evolving Indo-European society. Over the centuries, as steppe life evolved from small family groups of herders to tribes, confederations, and nations, and from individual warriors to raiding bands to warfare, these young warrior wolf packs also evolved from their beginnings as small groups of boys sent off to live in the wilds into one of the key features of Eurasian culture, the heroic leader and his comitatus, a war band of dedicated friends sworn to die for him or with him. The comitatus had come into existence by the time of the Scythians, and would still be a core part of steppe culture by the time of the Mongol Empire. Alongside the comitatus, whose members were sworn to the war leader, there was also a strong institution of blood brotherhood, which was described by Greek and Roman authors writing about the Scythians, in the secret history of the Mongols, and by other foreigners writing about the steppe. In the mid-2nd century CE, Greek writer Lucian of Samosata wrote a dialogue between an Athenian and a Scythian entitled Friendship. In it, a Scythian, Toxaris, tells his Athenian friend, Mnissippus, that the Scythians are masters of true friendship, while the Greeks merely write about it. Mnissippus naturally objects to this assertion, and then the two take turns telling each other stories of true friendship to back up their arguments. Toxaris introduces the Scythian idea of friendship as, quote, "We do not form friendships like you, over wine cups, or because we're of an age, or from the same neighborhood. We wait until we see a brave man capable of valiant deeds, and we follow him with all attention. Our friendships are like your courtships. Rather than fail in our objective and suffer the disgrace of rejection, we patiently press our suit and give our constant attendance. Finally, a friend is accepted and solemnized with our sacred oath, to live together, and if need be, to die for one another. The friends draw blood from their fingers into a cup, dip the tips of their sword in it, and drink. And from that point they keep faith in each other, and nothing can part them." End quote. There was no fixed number of members in a comitatus. Some were a few dozen warriors, some thousands, with an inner circle of the Lord's closest friends. The wolf and dog imagery was commonly used to refer to them. Chinggis Khan had 4 warriors in his comitatus: Kubilai, Jaume, Jebe, Subide, who Jamukha, Chinggis Khan's rival for leadership of the Mongols, called the 4 fierce wolves of Chinggis. The oath sworn when joining the comitatus superseded any previous kinship or allegiance. The fierce wolf Jebe, for example, began as Chinggis's enemy before swearing his loyalty and receiving his name of Jebe. The comitatus became their new family. They lived with the Lord and were lavishly rewarded for their oath. The oath was to die for or with the Lord, and if they could not, they would commit ritual suicide and be buried with him, going fully armed into their graves, ready to do battle in the next world. The comitatus is found across Central Eurasia, in grave sites, descriptions, and early literature, such as the Rig Veda's hymns to the Marut chariot warriors the Comitatus of Indra. The Comitatus formed the core of each Central Eurasian nation as it appeared. In later times, it could number thousands of warriors and require continual action to acquire the wealth necessary to maintain. As world religions, with taboos on suicide and ritual murders penetrated the steppe, the idea of the Comitatus going to the grave with their lord was gradually abandoned. But the core of the sworn band remained well into the Christian and Islamic eras. Among the steppe peoples, the Comitatus is attested for the Scythians, Parthians and other Persians, Khwarezmians and Huns, Hephthalites, Turks, Khazars, Uyghurs, Mongols, Sogdians and others. It was adopted for a while in Byzantium, in the imperial Heteria, a company of Khazars, Turks and Magyars responsible for protection of the emperor, and by the Chinese emperors who took defeated Turkic warriors into their service. The Arabs also adopted it from the Turks that they conquered. The Comitatus was also found among the Slavs. Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan, who was part of an Abbasid Caliphate embassy to the Volga Bulgars and wrote a detailed description of the Volga Vikings, noted about the Rus that, quote, "One of the customs of the king of Rus is he has with him in his palace 400 of his most valiant and trusted men. They die when he dies, and are killed for his sake." End quote. This band of retainers would become the Russian druzhina, a word derived from drug, or friend. So, we have a band of warriors, the personal guard of the king or lord, loyal only to him and not the state or government, sworn to defend him to the death or die trying, and ready to commit suicide and be buried with him if they failed, something that Greek, Chinese, Roman and Arab sources noted they actually did when the situation arose. As Ibn Fadlan wrote about the Khazars, quote, "When the ruler is buried, the heads of those who buried him are struck off and laid with him. His grave is called Paradise, and they say he has entered Paradise. All the chambers are filled with silk and gold." End quote. But what was in it for them? Well, there's always the idea of honour and glory, and somebody must have thought getting killed to get famous was worth it, given all the stories written about warriors doing just that over the centuries. But mostly they did it for wealth and prestige. The Comitatus, especially the core group of the Lord's closest friends, the ones who would advise him and lead the others in his place, shared the Lord's housing and were showered with riches. They had the highest position in their society, in this world and the next. They wore silk clothes, bought with horses sold to China, decorated their clothing and weapons with gold and jewels, and ate and drank the best food at their Lord's table. Xuanzang, a Chinese Buddhist monk who went on a pilgrimage to India and wrote the Great Tang Records on the Western regions, one of the most important sources on the early steppe, was amazed by his visit to Tung Yagbikhagan, ruler of the Western Turks, and his 200 sworn friends, all resplendent in embroidered silk robes. Byzantine visitors to the Western Turks were also astonished by the amount of gold and silk on display. Marco Polo describes Kublai Khan giving his 12,000 bodyguards 13 different coloured silk robes each, embroidered with pearls and jewels, noting that the cost of these robes, 156,000 of them in all, amounts to a quantity of treasure that is almost past computation. All the foreign visitors to the Mongols noted how commonly worn gold brocade was. As the flip side of the reward for this unswerving loyalty, the punishment for anyone who broke their oath was disgrace and death. The secret history of the Mongols relates how a warrior abandoned his lord, who being on the losing side against the rising Chinggis Khan, was no longer able to reward him with riches, and declared he would serve Chinggis Khan instead. The Khan declared that a man who would abandon his lord could not be trusted, and ordered him executed. The Comitatus and wolf warriors are described among peoples across the steppe, and in the descendants of groups who emerged from the steppe even centuries earlier, from Vikings and Anglo-Saxons in the west to the corius in the east. It was not characteristic of the peripheral cultures around them, who often mentioned it precisely because they found the idea of a dedicated warband collecting rewards for their willingness to die strange and unusual. Procopius described the practice among the Hephthalites, or White Huns. Quote, "The wealthy citizens attach 20 or more friends to themselves as permanent banquet companions who have a share in all their property, enjoying some kind of common right in this matter. When a man who has gathered such a company comes to die, it is the custom that all these men go alive into the tomb with him." End quote. The name he gives for their city, Gorgon, means wolves. Chinese sources refer to common fated ones, who when their lord dies, commit suicide to be buried with him, along with his horses and trinkets. The information that is available on the Scythians, Huns, Turks, and other peoples, in contemporary Greek, Roman, and Chinese sources, very closely matches the descriptions of how the Mongols were organized, which we have available in considerable detail from the Mongols' own records and foreign visitors, including Marco Polo. Chinggis Khan's Comitatus was carefully structured according to the Khan's orders. His personal bodyguard, the Kesig, was recruited from his nokod, or friends, and included a day watch of 70 men, a night watch of 80, and a group of warriors known as the Batur, or heroes. The Kesig served as guards and domestics. They were his chamberlains, stewards, quiver-bearers, doorkeepers, and grooms. They supervised female attendants, and the people who looked after the herds and took care of the Khan's tents, carts, weapons, and so on. As his personal guard, household, and administration, the Kesig went with Chinggis Khan wherever he went, whether conquering new territory or hunting. Although the Greeks, Romans, and Chinese did not have their own tradition of the Comitatus, steppe warriors served as mercenaries all over the place and took their practices with them. When Tai Tong, the second Tang emperor, died, several Turkic generals who had sworn fealty to him wanted to commit suicide. The Chinese prohibited them doing so, but one did anyway. So, we have a band of sworn warriors following a leader in exchange for wealth and honor, swanning around in silk and gold brocade, wealthy enough to be buried with horses, gold, and weapons. The question that naturally arises is, where does the money come from? And this is not just a simple point of interest. As I already said, the Comitatus was the keystone of steppe cultures. Without it, the Scythians, Huns, and Turks may never have emerged in the form that they did. There were three options open to them to acquire wealth. The first two, warfare and tribute, were the default choices for all early states. When you think of steppe warriors, raiding and pillaging, extracting payment under threat of violence. That is, doing the things that made everyone, from the ancient Chinese to medieval Europeans, describe them as horrifying savages. They were just doing the same thing that the Romans, Greeks, or Chinese were doing. The Romans were only upset that people were attacking them. It was just fine for them to march into Gaul or wherever and kill or enslave everyone they found. As historian Christopher Beckwith writes, quote, "When Chinese or Romans demanded payment from other nations, it is called tribute or taxation by most historians. When Central Eurasians, that is, our steppe nomads, demanded it, it is called extortion." End quote. However, the main source of wealth across Central Eurasia was trade. In sedentary societies, with an economy based on agriculture, from ancient times right up to the modern era, honourable wealth was seen to lie in land ownership and the produce of the land. Merchants were nearly always seen as secondary, and the profit they made by moving goods produced by one set of people working the land to another set of people who paid for it with what they made working their land, was often seen as somehow dishonest, an unearned imposition on honest labour. Not so in the steppe and Central Eurasia. For people who did not value owning land, trade was honourable and desirable, and foreigners writing about them from the ancient world to medieval times noted how commercially minded they were and the extent of their trade in agricultural products, animals, metals, silks, spices, and other goods. Indeed, steppe warriors would often raid their sedentary neighbours, specifically to force them to start trading. This was particularly true in the east. Local Chinese residents were usually happy to trade with the nomads, but in periods when the central government exerted closer control over the borders, restrictions, taxes, and prohibitions were put in place. So the nomads would raid to force them to go back to trading. Records of the peace settlements made with raiders from Europe to China show that they were always looking for trading rights. So the Silk Roads, the network of trade and cultural exchange between China and the Mediterranean, first appeared as a fundamental element of the steppe economy. And over the centuries, the waxing and waning of the Silk Road trade coincided with the rise and fall of the various steppe empires. So, as we draw to the end of these 2 episodes on steppe warriors, you should be able to see that they had the means and the motivation to move out and conquer or subjugate the peoples around them. Their composite bows and heavy lances, combined with riding skills and tactics that sedentary infantry armies found difficult to counter, gave them a military advantage for centuries, while their social structure fed a constant demand for goods and treasure to reward the leader's followers. For nearly 2,000 years, these factors would drive the formation of confederations, nations, and empires of nomadic tribesmen, some enduring for a couple of centuries, some only as long as the warlord who founded them lived, that expanded and migrated from the steppe west into Russia, seeking tribute and taxpayers and opportunities for trade. In the next episode, we return to the chronological narrative and begin following those waves of migration. Please bookmark the website, the RussianEmpireHistoryPodcast.com, for supplementary resources, and share this podcast with your friends, and leave your reviews on the website, Apple Podcasts, or your chosen app. You can contact me through the Russian Empire History Podcast on Facebook or Twitter, or by email at hello@therussianempirehistorypodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me next time.